Hey friends, it's Just the Gems. I'm Brandon. If you're a JRPG collector, you know how hard it is to find hidden gems that aren't going to absolutely obliterate your bank account. Back in the day, RPGs typically had smaller print runs because at the time, there weren't as many JRPG fans out there. We were a rare species. Rare, but beautiful. But anyway, that's changed and suddenly JRPG fans are a dime a dozen, which makes these games thousands of dimes a dozen. They're expensive. But what if I told you I had put together a list of hidden gems that are affordable? What's that? You'd say, yeah, duh, that's what the video's titled. Well, yeah, sure. So here you go. 10 JRPGs for the PlayStation 2 that won't leave you penniless and will give you a good time. And I might be joined by a special guest here at some point, so stay tuned. Oh, and real quick, clarification on affordable. Since new games are going for as much as $80 US these days, I'm considering it affordable if it's under $80. That makes sense, right? That's the market we live in. Regardless, there's only a few that creep that high anyway, but just wanted to throw that disclaimer in there. Let's go. Depending on which Tales fan you ask, there are a variety of places where the series really starts to get good. Some would say Tales of Phantasia way back on the Super Famicom knocked it out of the park from the very beginning. Others would argue that it wasn't until Tales of Symphonia that the series really reached its stride. But there's a strong argument to be made for Tales of the Abyss as being the early high watermark for these games. If you're not familiar with the game, you might have at least heard a bit about the main character. His name is Luke, and he's a real tool. Seriously, he's a spoiled brat, and it's not surprising that no one is super fond of him. At least not until a bit later in the game. Luke is actually one of these protagonists that undergoes a pretty enormous change over the course of the story, and the horrible things he goes through and the people he's surrounded by have a really profound impact on him. The world the game takes place in is basically set on a course throughout history by this prophecy that had been written up generations before. Someone learned how to tap into one of the primary elements of the universe and used it to map out a future that would be utopian and perfect. The only downside being that some really horrible things would have to happen to some people along the way. Naturally, our heroes aren't into that. It wouldn't be an anime-inspired JRPG if a bunch of young people weren't fighting against fate. This game is full of that Tales charm with skit scenes sprinkled throughout that are just there to allow the characters to have conversations and develop. And the combat was really starting to come into its own at this point. This wasn't necessarily the game that first made me fall in love with Tales, that was Eternia back on the PS1, but it was the first one that made me excited for the rest of the 3D Tales games to come. It's an absolute PS2 classic, and there's also a version on the 3DS you can hunt down if you prefer playing handheld. Definitely worth the investment either way. Okay, I know what you're thinking, a Final Fantasy game on an underrated JRPG list. What is this guy smoking? To answer your second question first, barbecue ribs, but how did you know I was smoking anything? That's creepy. Are you outside my house right now? As for putting a Final Fantasy on this list, is there any Final Fantasy that's as underrated as Final Fantasy X-2? It's debatable, but I'd say no. X-2 had the unenviable task of following up the first Final Fantasy of the new generation of consoles, not to mention being the first ever direct Final Fantasy sequel. And the game it was a sequel to had one of the most beautiful and heartfelt endings of any video game ever. So really the deck was stacked against it from the beginning. I think a lot of people still view it as that weird Final Fantasy spinoff where Yuna is a pop star, and that's... I mean, technically it's true, but it's pretty reductive. Final Fantasy X-2 stars three cool ladies. You've got Yuna, arguably the protagonist of the first Final Fantasy X. You've got Riku, her cousin, who's super spunky and bubbly. And you've got Pain, a new girl in town, still clinging to that goth phase like it's never going out of style. Together, they are the Gullwings, and they make it their mission to fly around the world of Spira in search of spheres. There are reasons Yuna in particular wants to find spheres, but to go into specifics would technically be a spoiler for Final Fantasy X, so out of an abundance of caution, I'll just say, she has a good motivation for joining this team. The game world is largely open from the start since you can use your airship to visit most places whenever you want. This much flexibility is in stark contrast to Final Fantasy X's strictly linear progression, so it was cool to see the same world as the previous game in a new context. For the first time that I remember, the combat took center stage for me. I've always been a story-first guy, and the story here is quite different and maybe not as grand as the original Final Fantasy X's, but the gameplay really won me over in a big way. It returns to the active time system from earlier entries as opposed to the conditional turn-based system that 10 used. It also incorporates the job system that several games have implemented, but it does it in a way that I actually enjoy. Yeah, I'm not the biggest job system fan, but honestly, finding the dress spheres in Final Fantasy X-2 worked for me, as did how quickly you could swap between jobs mid-fight. This game is dirt cheap on the PS2, but it's also available on a lot of modern consoles as part of the Final Fantasy X and X-2 Remastered collection, so you have options. Highly recommend checking this one out however you can. When it comes to Shin Megami Tensei, it seems the mainline SMT games and the Persona games tend to hog the spotlight. But SMT is maybe the most prolific of series when it comes to spin-offs, and one of the very best spin-offs it ever had was Digital Devil Saga on the PlayStation 2. The way I've described this to friends is like, if you really enjoyed the combat and vibes of SMT3 Nocturne, but wanted more of a story and characters, then Digital Devil Saga is for you. You're a part of the Embryon, which is a group of people in constant conflict with several other groups in this absolutely desolate, war-torn world called the Junkyard. Early on, your team catches a nasty virus that allows them to turn into demons. I mean, it wouldn't be SMT without demons, right? Fortunately, they meet a girl named Sarah who's able to keep their demonic powers under control by singing. Because this is still anime, so you better believe some girl is going to be having an outsized influence on a war through the power of song. So anyway, the goal of the Embryon, and all the other tribes too, presumably, is to kill everyone else so they're allowed to ascend to Nirvana. That's the setup for the first game, but both Digital Devil Saga 1 and 2 are absolutely vital. It's one continuous story, so this is one place where you're definitely not okay to start with the sequel. To say anything about the plot of the second game would be to spoil a pretty significant part of the first, so I won't. But suffice it to say, the story here is one of the main reasons you'll want to keep playing. That and the combat. If you're already a fan of SMT, then you know what to expect. It's the press turn system, which means you have a set number of turns each round, and you can increase your turns by using attacks that your enemies are weak against. But they can do the same, and if you happen to use an attack that an enemy is strong against, you lose turns. It's a system that rewards experimentation and punishes it in equal measures, so you'll want to buckle in for a sometimes bumpy ride. Characters can join forces to make combos, and there's some interesting mechanics that vary depending on whether you're in human form or demon form. Honestly, it's still astounding these games haven't been remastered for modern hardware. It's likely to happen, I think even more so if the upcoming Raido Remastered does well, but in the meantime, you can grab both of these games for less than the price of one AAA new game today, so it's very worth it. The Atelier series has gotten a new lease on life thanks to Ryza. People like her for other reasons. Anyway, because of the new popularity of games like Atelier Ryza and Atelier Yumiya, it can be easy to forget that the Atelier series has always been extra niche. Like, in an already niche market, the Atelier games were the niche of the niche. The niche in law. The first game in the series that we ever received in the West was Atelier Iris Eternal Mana. And if you can believe it, it doesn't star an anime girl. No, despite the misleading name, Atelier Iris stars Klain Kiesling. Klain is a wandering alchemist who gets caught up in a big grand fate of the world sort of thing. You know how it goes. Anyway, this one exemplifies that sort of chaotic energy of mid-2000s English dubs. Yeah, you might be rolling your eyes occasionally, but it's all good fun. You're joined by the customary party of misfits like Lita, who saves Klain early on in the game from a monster attack, and Norn, the requisite anime cat girl. It definitely maintains the series' trademark lightheartedness, along with its tradition of just some absolutely incredible music. Seriously, I love how hard the Gust composers go with the soundtrack to this game. The 2D hand-drawn art is gorgeous. If you're at all nostalgic for a time when games didn't all look hyper-realistic, you're gonna love the way this game looks. I guarantee it. The combat is pretty straightforward turn-based, with some light positioning being the main way it differentiates itself. Also, Klain as the alchemist is able to use mana items in combat, and he can synthesize certain ones mid-battle to use. The synthesis in general is definitely a less refined version of what's to come, like you'd expect. You find ingredients in the world, you synthesize them together, you make new items. I think this one is a good fit for two kinds of people. First, if you're an Atelier fan already, but you started a bit later in the series, I think you'll have fun going back and seeing what the games were like a little closer to the series' origin. Or, if you're just in the mood for some extremely retro 2D JRPG fun, this one checks all the boxes. It's lighthearted, it's beautiful, it's a good time all around. Okay, wait, hear me out. I know Breath of Fire Dragon Quarter is sort of the black sheep of the series. I mean, aside from Breath of Fire 6, which we do not acknowledge. But I think there's something really interesting going on in this game that makes it worth a look, especially for the price. So Dragon Quarter is about a guy named Ryu, like always, who can turn into a dragon. The big difference this time is that Ryu and everyone live deep underground in some sort of bunker. The world above was destroyed, apparently, and now people are divided up into different classes based on their D ratio. Give you one guess as to what that stands for. Dragon. Stands for dragon. What were you thinking? Don't be gross. Ryu's is pretty abysmally low at the start of the game, like 1 over 8,192. Throughout the game, your D ratio increases, but here's where the game's system and story converge in a really interesting way that was honestly a bit ahead of its time. It's impossible, basically, to complete this game on your first attempt. At a certain point, you won't be able to progress any further, and the only choice is to use the restore option on the game over screen. This brings you back to the beginning of the game, but lets you carry over equipment and skills and whatnot, as well as your D ratio. Certain cutscenes and areas of the game are actually inaccessible if you haven't achieved a certain D ratio. By replaying and progressing further each time, you get more and more insight into the story and the world, and you're continually getting stronger as well. Sure, it's a bit non-traditional, but I think nowadays, with the wider spread of roguelikes, this sort of value proposition isn't completely crazy like it felt back when this game first came out. It's definitely one of the most unique JRPGs out there, and for around $15, you really can't lose. Maybe you won't love it, but there's a chance it'll really click with you, and that's a relatively cheap risk worth taking. Real quick, if you're enjoying this so far, would you consider liking the video and maybe subscribing if you're not already? It really helps me out, and I super appreciate it. Okay, back to the games. To be perfectly honest, I haven't played Radiata Stories, but my good friend and podcast co-host Abdallah swears by this game, and I feel like if I made a list of affordable PS2 JRPG gems and didn't include it, he'd kill me. So I asked him to tag in and tell you about it.
Thanks, Brandon, for that intro, and yes, I do swear by Radiata Stories, because it's one of those rare games that blends charm, depth, and just straight up weirdness in a way only a PS2 era game can. At first glance, you might think it's your typical fantasy JRPG, you know, swords, guilds, dragons, the whole medieval starter pack. But what Radiata Stories does is takes that formula and adds in one major twist. Almost every NPC in the game has a daily routine and can be recruited into your party. You're living in a fully scheduled ecosystem. People go to work, they go home, they train, they sleep. Some only appear at night, and some only appear during the rain, and some only appear after some sort of quest. And when you're not chasing people down, you're engaged in real-time combat with a party of your choosing. The battle system's not going to compete with Kingdom Hearts in terms of flash, but it's functional. And the real hook is seeing how your eclectic party of bakers, scholars, and lizardmen somehow managed to survive a goblin ambush. But let's talk story. Radiata Stories opens with what feels like a classic underdog tale. Jack Russell, son of a legendary knight, joins the Royal Radiata Knights, hoping to live up to his father's legacy. And in true JRPG tradition, he's brash, overconfident, and about as subtle as a broadsword to the face. But what's surprising is how the game slowly pivots from that familiar setup into something way more layered. The city of Radiata and the world around it are steeped in brewing tension between humans and non-humans, elves, dwarves, goblins, and other fantasy races. At first, it feels like background world building, but the further you get, the more central it becomes. The game plays with themes of prejudice, diplomacy, and loyalty without ever feeling preachy. And it isn't afraid to explore the fallout when people in power act out of fear instead of understanding. Also worth mentioning is the tone. The game's got jokes, like real jokes. It's not afraid to be goofy, break the fourth wall, or have you kick literally everything in the environment just to see what happens. You want to kick a bookshelf? Do it. Kick a cow? Sure. Kick your own teammate in mid-battle? That's a feature. Radiata Stories is the kind of game that makes you wish other JRPGs took just as big a swing. It's weird, wonderful, and still affordable, at least for now. So if you're building a PS2 collection and you want something that feels truly unique, this one's worth your time.
Thanks, Dala. Oh, and be sure to go subscribe to his channel, Dala Games. He talks about retro games and cool hardware stuff and a bunch more. Link is in the description. There's been a lot of hype around Suikoden lately, and for good reason. The HD remasters of Suikoden 1 and 2 are fantastic, and I'm really hoping a lot of new people get introduced to the series. It was one of the best JRPG series on 32-bit hardware. While Suikoden 1 and especially Suikoden 2 get a lot of praise thrown their way, I want to take a minute to stump for part 3. Suikoden 3 was the series' big move to 3D, and admittedly, the transition looks a little rough. You can see these animations, there's no disguising that. But what didn't get harmed in the transition to 3D is the storytelling and combat, and those are the most important parts when it comes to a JRPG. True, the combat is quite a bit different than the previous 2 games. While you still have 6 characters in your battle party, they work in pairs, so functionally you're dealing with 3 units of 2 characters. It's a change, sure, but the systems are still enjoyable. More than anything though, the story was what captivated me. There are 3 protagonists this time, and unlike other Suikodens, they all have dialogue and personalities. That alone is immediately going to put this game on a higher plane as far as I'm concerned. Down with silent protags in JRPGs. Yeah, I said it. Anyway, you can pick a character to start with, and then choose at the end of every chapter which character's story you'd like to continue with. At a certain point, all the characters' stories converge, and that's when things really get started. This was one of the earliest examples of a JRPG series using strong continuity between titles. This game takes place less than 20 years after Suikoden 2, for example, and familiar faces show up. It's probably the series that sparked my love for that whole grand, sweeping narrative style you see in games like Kingdom Hearts and the Trails series. If you've just gotten on the Suikoden train with the remasters, you can continue the series for a pretty reasonable price, and I think it's a trip worth taking. Look, I'm not going to sit here and tell you Tsugunai Atonement is some amazing game with the best story and the best combat I've ever seen. It's fine. At the time of its release, it was a bit of a breath of fresh air because there weren't a ton of JRPGs for the PlayStation 2 just yet, and having something, anything, was always going to be good enough. But one thing in particular got me excited about this game before it released, and it was enough excitement to get me to follow through with the purchase, and that's the fact that Yasunori Mitsuda composed the music. Yeah, I'm a JRPG soundtrack sicko, I can't help it. Show me Mitsuda or like Go Shina was involved, and I'm laying my money down day one. Keep in mind, this was still early days in his career. He had some heavy hitters under his belt at this point, Chrono Trigger, Xenogears, Chrono Cross, but I was salivating for more Mitsuda, what can I say? And I wasn't disappointed. This is a really nice body of music, and it carries more than its weight in terms of the game's overall value. As for the game itself, like I said, it's probably not going to blow you away. You play a mercenary who pisses off the gods and has his body and soul separated. As his soul, you have to atone for your sins by possessing different villagers and helping solve their problems. You'll have to fight as certain villagers in turn-based combat. It's not a huge scale sort of story, and honestly, I think it's nice to take the occasional break from world saving and focus on something a little more narrow. This one is easy for me to recommend to people like me who love a good soundtrack, but honestly, the music is available to purchase as well, so if you're not that into the game, at least check that out. If you've played many of the Ys games, you know that they started making big changes around Ys 7. Ys, the Ark of Napishtim, is sort of the last bastion of the classic Ys formula, and in execution, it's as close to perfect as you can get. I don't know why it doesn't seem to get as much love as some of the other titles, but it's a lot of fun. Everything you'd expect from an Ys game, all the crazy combat it's become known for. Plus, you get a really interesting story that manages to tie in characters and plots from other games in the series, something most of the titles just don't do. It's like the Avengers Endgame of the Ys universe. Well, kind of. It's still Ys, but I mean, it was really cool to see these things so overtly referenced from other titles. With the recent re-release of The Oath and Felghana, it wouldn't shock me if this eventually got the remaster treatment, but then again, I'm not going to hold my breath for it either. So if you're interested in one of the most significant classics in the Ys series, this one is affordable and it's more than worth the money. I saved the best for last. Yes, Shadow Hearts Covenant is creeping up there in price, especially compared to most of these, but it's still below $80, and darn it, I'm calling that a win for a game like this. Is it possible that the reason I set the benchmark at 80 for affordable so that I can include Shadow Hearts Covenant? It's possible. It's possible. This is the direct sequel to Shadow Hearts, and while knowledge of that game will give you a bit more context on the main character Yuri, it's not gonna make or break anything for you. Covenant picks up in the aftermath of the first game and has Yuri teaming up with a German lieutenant named Karen to hunt down some ancient manuscript that's naturally super powerful. Oh, that's right. If you're not familiar, the Shadow Hearts series takes place in an alternate reality in the early 1900s, so we're talking World War I era. Yuri and Karen end up getting joined by one of the craziest casts of characters ever assembled for a JRPG. You've got a fortune teller, a wrestling vampire, a puppeteer, a very good dog, and even Anastasia, like the princess from Russia. They made a movie about her. It's called Anastasia. So yeah, anyway, the cast is stacked and it's pretty nuts. Not only are the characters super varied, but the story presentation is just extremely ahead of its time. Most scenes are fully blocked and voice acted, and it achieves a level of presentation that might even be above Final Fantasy X. Some of the music was even made by Yasunori Mitsuda, and I've already told you what a sicko I am for that. And that's even before we get to the combat, which uses the Judgment Ring system. It's basically a unique way of implementing timed button presses to strengthen your attacks. The nice thing about this system, though, is that you can find items that adjust the Judgment Ring and give you more of an advantage. And you can completely set it to auto if you're just not into it. This is one game that I can't believe completely slipped my attention during the PS2 era, and I'm incredibly glad I got around to playing it. I highly, highly recommend you do the same. And that's all I have for now. What do you think? Interested in any of these? Let me know in the comments. Once again, I would just ask that you consider liking the video and subscribing and hitting the bell and all that good stuff, because it just helps me out a ton. Thanks so much for watching, and until next time, bye.